years ago, forests dominated the landscape in Pennsylvania. The forests had an important role in the economic development and settlement pattern of the state. Although you wouldn't know that by reading most history books, which look at Pennsylvania as a source of coal, steel mills, agriculture, and railroads. But the forest did have a major role to play. There are 29 million acres of land in Pennsylvania. 5.5 million acres are in cities and towns, roads, rights-of-ways, rivers, and lakes. And another 6.5 million acres are in farms and pasture land. But 17 million acres are covered by trees and classified as forests. Originally, almost all 29 million acres were covered with trees, the exception being the major rivers and a few natural lakes that occur in the northeastern and northwestern corners of the state, a few rock slides on the sides of the Ridge and Valley mountains, and here and there along some of the major rivers, relatively small areas that were cleared by the Native American for agricultural purposes. But you might say that for the most part, Pennsylvania was covered with trees 300 years ago. The first European settlers were primarily farmers and couldn't wait to get rid of the trees, oftentimes girdling them to kill them and planting their crops in between the dead trees until such time that the stumps could be pulled and the land cleared. Much of the timber was just rolled into large piles and burned to produce potash, which was used for making soap. A small amount of the timber cut from the agricultural clearing operation was used for log houses and log barns, and a small amount was also sawed on water-powered up and down mills to provide flooring, wood for cabinetry, and house trim. Every small farming community had a grist mill to grind grain, and it was a common practice to operate a sawmill along with that grist mill. Although the relative amount of timber sawed on those mills was very low. The first really major industrial use of the timber resource occurred in the mid-1700s with the development of the iron industry. The iron industry needed three things: a source of iron ore, which was common throughout southern and central Pennsylvania, a flux that would separate the iron from the dirt in the ore, and limestone was relatively plentiful, and they needed a source of heat to smelt the ore. And that source of heat came from charcoal produced from wood. The process was to cut trees into 4 to 6 foot lengths, pile them in teepee form, cover the teepee with a layer of dirt, and make a small hole at the bottom and a small hole at the top, then set fire to the wood under that earthen cover. And after 2 weeks, the gases would all be driven off, and all that would remain would be a pile of charred wood that could then be loaded into wagons and taken to one of the iron furnaces. By 1810, there were 44 iron furnaces in Pennsylvania, and by the 1860s, the time of the Civil War, there were over 150 iron furnaces operating in Pennsylvania. It took between 30 and 35,000 acres of timberland to produce the charcoal for one iron furnace. So we estimate that somewhere between 3 and 3.5 million acres of timberland were repeatedly cut for charcoal between the mid-1700s and 1900, when the charcoal-fired furnaces were replaced by the Bessemer coke ovens, primarily in Bethlehem, Harrisburg, and Pittsburgh. Another early timber resource was discovered in central Pennsylvania, and that was the magnificent white pine growing on the river slopes and up on top of the plateau. Some of the most magnificent white pine to occur any place in the world. It was in great demand for spars for a clipper ship. A #1 spar that held the mast had to be 96 feet in length and 15 inches in diameter at the top. Pennsylvania produced literally thousands of #1 spars. During this early 1800 period, The only transportation system in central Pennsylvania were the rivers. So the spar logs were brought out and rafted down the Delaware, the Susquehanna, and the Allegheny rivers. Trees at that time had to be cut down with an axe. The saw had not been improved to the point where a tree could be sawed down. Trees that were not large enough to make a number one spar were still in demand for flooring and for woodwork. So woodsmen in central and northern Pennsylvania would square a log with a broadaxe before it was brought out to the edge of the river, because a man could square a log with a broadaxe faster than it could be sawed square on a water-powered mill. Only trees that were relatively close to the river's courses were harvested during this early 1800 period. And the harvesting occurred primarily in the wintertime when the ground was snow-covered. The logs would be piled along the river's edge, waiting for the spring thaw when the snow would melt and there would be enough water in the river to float the rafts. The rafts were constructed entirely of wood. Holes were drilled in the logs and a lash pole put across the holes, and then wooden bows and pins driven over the lash pole to hold the logs in place. What looks like a rudder at the end of the raft is actually an oar. The raft traveled at the same speed as the water in the river, and a rudder would have no effect. So they mounted an oar on both the front and back of the raft, and a crew of anywhere from 2 to 6 men would operate the oar to go around islands and through chutes in dams that occurred in the river. A typical raft was 26 feet in width, 115 feet in length, and it was a common practice for some of the farmers and loggers in central and northern Pennsylvania to make shingles that would also be loaded on the rafts for shipment to the developing cities in southern Pennsylvania. Oftentimes, shanties were built on the rafts to house the crew on their trip downstream. We have records of rafts going down the Allegheny, which then went down the Ohio and down the Mississippi as far as New Orleans. Now, it would have made a wonderful trip, I'm sure, but you have to remember that no matter where the raft was finally tied up, the crews had to walk back. During the early 1800s, Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Columbia, Marietta, Wrightsville, and Philadelphia were all major sawmilling towns using the material that was rafted down the 3 major rivers. The next major development in Pennsylvania's lumber history occurred in 1851. By that time, both the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Pennsylvania Canal had pushed up the Susquehanna River as far as Williamsport. And a man by the name of John Dubois, who the town of Dubois was named for, and several other men, formed what they called the Susquehanna Boom Company. The Susquehanna boom was nothing more than a series of wooden cribs filled with stone with a log chain between each crib, built at an angle across the river to catch free-floating logs that had been dumped in the river upstream. Now, for the first time, logs less than 36 to 40 feet in length could be brought out to the river's edge. Anything down to 8 feet was usable. But here again, like the rafting days, only logs that were relatively easy to reach the stream were harvested. In some places, log slides were built to accommodate bringing the logs to the river's edge. The longest slide that we have recorded was in Clearfield County, and it was over 6 miles in length. The logs would, again, be harvested primarily in the wintertime when there was snow on the ground, and oxen were the primary beast of burden. in use to a much higher degree than horses. The logs would be piled along the river bank or on the ice itself, waiting for the spring thaw when they would be cut loose and float down the river to Williamsport. On streams that were too small to float logs on their own, some of the side tributaries to the major streams, splash dams were built. A splash dam was a log crib, earth-filled dam that would impound water during the spring thaw, and during the months before, all the timber on the hillside below the dam would be piled in the stream bottom, waiting for the dam to be opened, and literally flush the logs out of the small streams into the major rivers. If the logs didn't all go out on the first, what they called splash, they would close the gate on the dam, build up another head of water, and try again, until eventually the logs would reach the main stem of the river. And most of the log drives were done on the Susquehanna, although there were log drives that occurred on the other major rivers in Pennsylvania as well. The loggers would then move along with the logs as they floated in the river, keeping them from jamming up on the islands or at bridges or along the shore. It was a very dangerous job. I can't imagine what it would be like working in those conditions in February and March, right after the ice had gone out. And back in those days, insulated clothing was unheard of. The logs would move on down the river, primarily the west branch of the Susquehanna, and be caught in the boom at Williamsport. The boom would hold as many as 300 million board feet in any one year. Because of the location of the boom at Williamsport, that city became the lumber capital of the world between 1870 and 1880. Over 30 sawmills located on the banks of the Susquehanna River at Williamsport. The logs would have been branded upstream by the loggers to identify who had cut the timber, and as the logs were pulled out of the river at Williamsport, the brand would be recorded, and the loggers paid for their work some 6 to 9 months later. Occasionally, high floods would break the boom. The water pressure would be too much against the logs that were behind the boom, and the logs would break loose and float on down the river. This is an actual sail bill of the logs that had escaped the boom in 1887, and some of the logs were lodged along the river as far south as Columbia and Marietta and Port Deposit at the head of the Chesapeake Bay, and logs were even deposited around some of the islands and shores of the Chesapeake. Because of occasional flooding and the breaking of the boom, the Susquehanna boom went out of business in 1907. Another factor in the development of Pennsylvania's forest history was the improvements made to the crosscut saw. Prior to 1880, there were no raker teeth on a saw, and it was impossible to saw a tree down. They had to be chopped down with an axe. But after 1880, raker teeth were put on the saw, and it was now possible to actually saw a tree down. But the biggest and primary factor in Pennsylvania's deforestation occurred in 1885 with the development of the logging railroad engine. The logging railroad engines were, unlike the engines that were used on the major railroads at that time, in that they were much smaller and they were gear-driven for the most part. They were able to negotiate sharper curves and steeper grades than the rod engines that were typical on railroads like the B&O, the New York Central, and the Pennsylvania Railroad. This particular slide shows a Shea engine which had 3 pistons to drive the drive shaft that even went back underneath the water tender. Now, for the first time, logging was no longer restricted to watercourses for transportation. It was after 1885 that logging occurred up on the Allegheny Plateau and in the mountain section of the Ridge and Valley Province. Some of the railroads were very sophisticated, such as this one on northern Somerset County, and others were very plain, such as this one in the Seven Mountains section south of State College. It was nothing more than two hand-hewed logs spaced apart with an iron ribbon spiked to the logs to keep the engine and cars from falling off. Horses now replaced oxen to get the logs to the railroad. It was possible to bring high-quality hay and grain up into the woods on the train, which horses needed. When the railroad logging first started, logs were loaded on the cars by hand. But by 1895, steam-powered log loaders were developed, which hastened the deforestation of Pennsylvania at even a more rapid rate. Mill towns sprang up everywhere. They were no longer required to be on a major river as a source of transportation. All they needed was a small stream to provide a pond that would clean the logs before they were sawn and to keep the logs from splitting in the summertime. The 1906 Lumberman magazine lists 24 towns in Pennsylvania where sawmilling was the major industry. Along with the sawmills came the development of secondary wood manufacturing industries. Over 5,000 industries located in Pennsylvania to utilize the lumber that was being produced during this railroad era. Manufacturing everything from hairbrush handles to clothespins to wooden spokes for Henry Ford's Model T. Some of the towns literally grew up overnight. This is a shot of Cross Forks in southern Potter County, about 1900, a population of 2,000 people. Cross Forks had 7 hotels, 5 grocery stores, 4 churches, and a YMCA. Most of the logging in the woods itself was done by Northern European immigrants coming from Norway and Sweden, Germany and Poland and Austria, and some of the other Slovak nations. My grandparents came from Sweden in the 1890s, early 1890s, and lived in a camp like this. My father was actually born in a logging camp like this in McKean County. The camps were temporary. After the timber was cut, they would move on to a new location and build another shanty. There's a misconception that old growth timber, or the virgin timber that was in Pennsylvania, was all large. This is a load of old growth timber coming off the ridge on the Seven Mountains on its way to the anthracite coal region, where it would be used for mine props and mine posts. Another industry that developed in Pennsylvania due to the forest resource was the leather industry, or tanning. During the early 1800s, most every farming community had a small family-operated tannery to produce leather for shoes and belts and similar items. But beginning in the 1880s, the leather industry moved into Pennsylvania due to the high availability of hemlock bark, which was high in tannic acid. And tannic acid is used both to preserve and soften leather. And it was easier to ship the hides to Pennsylvania than it was to ship the bark to the south where the hides were developed. The process was to cut the hemlocks in the spring of the year, just as growth started, and the bark would be easily peeled. It would be cut into 4-foot lengths, piled in the woods to dry for 6 months, then loaded onto railroad cars or wagons and taken to one of the tanneries. A typical bark stack we see here was 20 feet high and 24 feet wide, and they would have been hundreds of feet long. Much of the hemlock that was cut in the 1880s was left in the woods. The bark was worth more than the log was, But once the white pine had been harvested, which was a more desirable tree, then it became economical to bring out the hemlock logs and saw them as well. By 1920, there were 120 large tanneries located in Pennsylvania, and it was the 6th largest industry in the state. Once the hemlock bark had been harvested, the tanneries started to leave Pennsylvania, and today there's only one operating tannery left out of the 120 that was there during the 1920s. Another industry that developed in Pennsylvania due to the forest resource was the wood chemical business. Here the process was very similar to what was used to produce charcoal for the iron industry. The difference being now they were interested in not only the charcoal, but the gases that were driven off as well to produce wood alcohol, acetate of lime, and acetic acid. The process was to cut the trees into 4-foot lengths, pile them into iron railroad cars, then put the railroad car in an oven where the temperature would be driven up to 600 degrees and drive off the gases which were collected and distilled. There were some 40 of these chemical wood plants located in northern Pennsylvania. Now, due to the chemical plant that could use anything down to 3 or 3.5 inches in diameter, areas that had been harvested for saw timber were re-entered and everything was taken down to 3 inches in diameter. This picture could have been taken any place in the Allegheny Plateau by the 1920s. Pennsylvania's timber resource was gone. Fires were allowed to go uncontrolled over much of this cut-over land, leaving literally millions of acres of cut-over, burned-over, abandoned land. This is a shot of Mount Pocono over in the Poconos, taken in 1924, and there wasn't a tree on the top of Mount Pocono as high as the fender on that Model T Ford. Most of the areas that were harvested for timber came back due to natural regeneration, and one of the major components of the natural regeneration was the American chestnut. Both oak and chestnut can survive some fire, and they dominated the regenerating forest. But in 1907, the chestnut blight came into Pennsylvania, a disease of the chestnut, which spread across the state, literally wiping out the American chestnut, leaving us in at least central and southern Pennsylvania with a predominantly oak forest. Once thriving mill towns soon started to fall apart once the timber was gone. I mentioned earlier that in 1906 there were 24 towns where sawmilling was the major industry. Today, 14 of those 24 towns don't even exist, and only 3 of them are larger than they were in 1906. Houses in once prosperous Cross Fork were sold for $25 to any bidder. It was because of the impact of forest fire on the regenerating forest that the Bureau of Forestry was established. And their primary first role was to develop a detection system of fire towers to find out where the fires were occurring. And then develop a cadre of volunteer forest fire wardens that would go out and put out the fires. And they even had a few pieces of modern equipment at the time to help them with the fires. This is a shot of the town of Costello in Potter County, taken in 1917. Costello had a population of over 1,000 people. There was a sawmill and a tannery. In fact, the tannery was the largest in Pennsylvania, producing over 1,100 cowhides a day. The hills around Costello were horse-logged, where each log was dragged at the bottom of the hill down a skidway, and the next log was brought down that same skidway. Can you imagine when it rained, the erosion that would have taken place on this hillside. Note the field pattern and the bump on top of the hill. And we'll go from 1917 to 1970. I went back to Costello and took this picture, and I took it purposely in black and white so that it wouldn't contrast with the black and white from 1917. The hills around Costello are once again covered with trees. The tannery's gone, most of the houses are gone, and some of the houses today are hunting camps. But Pennsylvania is again over 50% covered with one of the most valuable forest resources to occur any place in the world. And if you're a good detective, you can go out into the forest and pretty well determine what the past history of the forest was. Many of the iron furnaces still remain, at least remnants of the furnaces remain. And charcoal hearths, where those teepees were built to produce charcoal for the iron furnaces, dominate much of the area in central and southern Pennsylvania, indicating that these forests, where you see the charcoal hearths, were cut repeatedly between the mid-1700s and 1900. Here and there we find a ring rock where rafts were tied up in the major rivers, or the remnants of a splash dam used to float logs out of the small tributaries, or the remnants of a log slide left after the timber had been removed. And very prominent throughout the Allegheny Plateau and the Ridge and Valley section of Pennsylvania are the remains of logging railroad grades that were put in to harvest the trees and are now used as hiking trails, biking paths, snowmobile paths, and cross-country ski trails. Here and there we find remnants of a logging camp. Our estimate is that this area was probably cut in 1918. At the time of the flu epidemic, some of the immigrant loggers that passed away in the logging camp were just buried with an unmarked stone. And a good detective can look at the remnants of a white pine stump and tell whether it was cut before 1880 with an axe or after 1880 with a crosscut saw. This particular stump has a flat top, indicating that it was cut after 1880. We can tell somewhat the fire history of the forest today, not only by the presence of this white pine charred snag in the, just off center in the photograph, but by the presence of what we call pioneer species, such as white birch, gray birch, and aspen, trees that are light-seeded, and the wind blows the seed in, and it germinates and requires almost a burned over bare soil to germinate. Areas that were lightly burned or not burned at all are where our highest quality hardwoods grow today, both the cherry, ash, oak, and poplar. Some 3.5 million acres of Pennsylvania were cleared for agricultural purposes during the 1800s and early 1900s. But since the 1930s have been abandoned to agriculture and have regenerated, for the most part, naturally to pioneer species. I would like to close by just reminding you that the forests of today are different than they were 200 years ago. And the forests 200 years in the future will be different than they are today. Because the forest is an ever-changing dynamic ecosystem. But through proper management and good stewardship, we can assure future generations that all the amenities that we enjoy in the forest will be available for generations yet to come. Thank you.